A racist cop humiliated a black mother in a diner, treating her like she was nothing. He laughed, mocked, and thought he was untouchable. But when her son walked in, placed his police chief badge on the table, and locked eyes with the officer, the entire room froze. What happened next left the cop shaking in fear. The warm scent of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee filled the small-town diner. The neon sign flickered outside, casting a dull red glow onto the rain-slick pavement. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's names, where old friends gathered to share stories over greasy breakfast plates. But for Angela Carter, today felt different. She had been coming to Maggie's diner for years. A single mother, she had raised her son Malcolm on long shifts and quiet sacrifices. She had wiped his tears, celebrated his victories, and instilled in him the values her own mother had given her: strength, dignity, and patience, even in the face of ignorance. But patience had its limits. Angela sat at her usual booth, sipping black coffee as she waited for her pancakes. She wasn't dressed fancy, just a simple blouse and jeans, but she carried herself with quiet grace. She had no idea her presence alone would become a problem. Across the room, Officer Rick Dunham leaned against the counter, stirring his coffee lazily. He was a middle-aged white cop, with a gut that hung over his belt, a face hardened by years of feeling like he was above everyone else. The badge on his chest made him feel powerful, untouchable. And he hated seeing people like Angela in places like this. She taking up a whole booth by herself, he muttered under his breath. The waitress, Sandy, an older woman with tired eyes, stiffened at his tone but said nothing. Everyone knew Rick had a problem with black folks, but no one ever dared to challenge him. Angela, oblivious to his glare, focused on her book. She was used to subtle racism, the looks, the forced smiles, the assumptions, but she had no idea today wouldn't be subtle at all. Rick walked over, his boots thudding against the old linoleum floor. He stopped at her table, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You waiting on someone?" he asked, voice dripping with condescension. Angela looked up, surprised. "Excuse me?" "I said," Rick continued louder this time, "are you waiting on someone, or are you just taking up space?" Angela blinked. The question was unnecessary. Half the diner had empty seats. She glanced around, noticing the sudden silence. Eyes darted away as if afraid to witness what was happening. "I'm just having breakfast," she said calmly. Rick scoffed. "Looks like you've been here a while. You sure you're not loitering?" Angela's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice even. "I ordered my food, officer. I'm not bothering anyone." Rick chuckled under his breath. "Well, I don't know about that. Some people don't appreciate—" He paused, his smirk widening. "Certain folks making themselves too comfortable." The air in the diner grew heavy. Sandy wiped the counter, pretending not to hear. The older couple in the booth nearby shifted uncomfortably. The teenage busboy, Eddie, stared at the floor. They all knew what was happening. They always knew. Angela exhaled slowly. She had seen men like Rick her whole life. Men who wore their hate like a badge of honor. Men who thought they could push people like her down because they never had to answer for it. "I think you should go," Rick said casually, picking up her coffee cup and inspecting it like it offended him. "We don't need trouble." Angela stared at him, her mother's words ringing in her ears. "There's a time to walk away, and a time to stand your ground." She straightened her shoulders. "And if I don't?" Rick's smirk faded. "Then I'll have to remove you myself." Angela opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a deep voice rang out from the doorway. "I'd love to see you try." The diner froze. Angela turned toward the entrance, and there, standing tall in a crisp uniform, was Malcolm Carter, her son, her pride, and the police chief of the entire department. The silence was deafening, Rick's face drained of color. His smirk was gone, replaced by something Angela had never seen before in him. Fear. The moment Malcolm Carter stepped into the diner, the entire room seemed to shrink. At 6'2", broad-shouldered, and dressed in his full police chief uniform, he was a commanding presence. The silver badge on his chest gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the gun holstered at his hip was a reminder that he wasn't just any officer. He was the highest-ranking one in the city. Angela's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. Her son, her boy, the same little Malcolm she had raised with love and discipline. The boy who grew up knowing that, as a black man, he'd always have to work twice as hard to get half as much. But now he was the one in charge. And Officer Rick Dunham finally seemed to realize that. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered on his face seconds ago was gone. His fingers twitched at his side. His eyes darted to the badge on Malcolm's chest, then to his own, a reminder that, in this moment, his authority meant nothing. "Mom," Malcolm said, his voice steady but sharp. He walked over to Angela's booth and placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Everything okay?" Angela knew her son, knew his tone, his body language, the way his jaw clenched when he was angry but holding it in, and right now, he was furious. Before she could answer, Rick let out a nervous chuckle. He tried to recover, forcing himself to stand tall. "Oh, hey there, Chief. Just having a little chat with your mother." Malcolm's eyes locked onto his. Cold, piercing, unforgiving. "A chat?" Malcolm repeated, his voice dangerously low. Rick swallowed. His fingers fumbled with the belt on his waist. "Yeah, you know, just making sure everything's running smooth around here." Angela watched as Malcolm reached into his pocket, pulled out his badge, and placed it firmly on the table. The metallic clink echoed through the diner like a gunshot. The power shifted instantly. The few customers still inside held their breath. Sandy, the waitress, looked away, pretending to wipe an already clean counter. The busboy, Eddie, gripped the tray in his hand so hard his knuckles turned white. Rick let out a forced laugh, but it came out shaky. "Chief Carter, look, this isn't what it looks like. I was just—" Malcolm cut him off. "You were just what?" Silence. Rick opened his mouth to respond, but Malcolm wasn't finished. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were harassing a woman minding her own business. It looks like you were trying to flex authority you don't have. And it looks like you picked the wrong person on the wrong day." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Rick's face turned red. "I didn't mean—" "What's your badge number?" Malcolm interrupted. Rick blinked. "Excuse me." Malcolm's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight behind it was heavier than a scream. "I said," Malcolm repeated, stepping closer. "What is your badge number?" Rick hesitated. He knew exactly what this meant. This wasn't just a warning. This was the beginning of the end. He stammered, "Chief, you don't have to. Badge. Number." Rick exhaled sharply and muttered the numbers under his breath. Louder. Rick gritted his teeth. 28,956. Malcolm nodded slowly. "Good." He pulled out his phone and typed something in. Rick's name, his badge number, a report. Rick's breathing turned shallow. His mind raced. Did Malcolm have enough to fire him? Suspend him? Then, Malcolm looked back at his mother. "Mom, did this man tell you to leave?" Angela nodded. "Yes." Malcolm turned back to Rick. "On what grounds?" Rick had no answer. "Did she break a law? Cause a disturbance?" Malcolm continued, his voice razor sharp. Rick's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He was drowning. The power he thought he had, gone. The security of his badge, shattered. And the worst part? The entire diner was watching. Malcolm stared at him for a long moment, then spoke in a voice that sent chills down Rick's spine. "You will apologize to my mother," Rick blinked. "Well, what?" "You heard me." Rick's hands curled into fists. He was losing control and he hated it. But he wasn't in charge anymore. The entire diner was silent, watching, waiting. Angela could see it in Rick's eyes. The realization. If he refused, his career was over. He swallowed his pride, looked at Angela, and forced out the words. I'm sorry." Angela lifted her chin. "For what?" Rick clenched his jaw. Malcolm stepped forward. "Say it." Rick exhaled sharply. His voice was tight, bitter. "I'm sorry for disrespecting you." Angela let the words hang in the air before giving a slow nod. "That's a start." Malcolm took a step back. "Now, here's what's going to happen, Officer Dunham. You're going to walk out of this diner, go back to your station, and wait for a call from Internal Affairs." Rick's stomach dropped. "Internal Affairs?" he choked out. "That's right," Malcolm said. "Because I don't just let things slide." Rick felt the blood drain from his face. Angela sipped her coffee, finally feeling the respect she deserved. And for the first time in his life, Officer Rick Dunham knew what it felt like to be powerless. Rick couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight. His skin burned with humiliation, and the eyes of the diner patrons felt like daggers piercing into his back. Just minutes ago, he had been the one in control, talking down to Angela, making her feel small, asserting his authority like he always did. Now he was the one being put in his place. And it was happening in front of everyone. Malcolm's words still rang in his ears. "Because I don't just let things slide." Rick's mind was spinning. Internal Affairs. That was serious. Officers didn't just get called into Internal Affairs unless something big was happening. Unless someone had real power to make it happen. And Malcolm Carter, he was that someone. Rick swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He needed to find a way out of this. "Come on, Chief," Rick tried, forcing a weak chuckle. "You're not actually going to report this, right? I mean, what's the harm in a little misunderstanding?" Malcolm's expression didn't change. Cold, calculated, unforgiving. "You think this was a misunderstanding?" His voice was eerily calm, but the weight behind it was crushing. Rick licked his lips. "Look, Malcolm took a step closer, his voice dropping lower. "Number, I want you to say it," he demanded. "Tell me exactly what part of this was a misunderstanding. Was it when you targeted my mother for no reason? Or was it when you tried to intimidate her into leaving? Or maybe, just maybe, it was when you realized who I was, and suddenly you wanted to backpedal." Rick's mouth opened. Nothing came out, because Malcolm was right, and they both knew it. The diner was deathly silent. Sandy, the waitress, nervously wiped the counter, her hands shaking. She had never seen anyone put Rick in his place like this. The busboy, Eddie, was frozen, his tray clutched against his chest. He had spent months keeping his head down, afraid to cross Rick, afraid to speak up. But now, someone was actually holding Rick accountable. Rick's fingers twitched at his belt. His last weapon, his badge, was still there. His uniform, his gun, his title. It was all still there. But for the first time, it didn't mean a thing. Because in this moment, he was just a man exposed for who he really was. And Malcolm was the one with real power. Rick let out a shaky breath. "Look, Chief, Malcolm cut him off. "Save it." Rick flinched. "You've already made your choices," Malcolm continued. "And now? It's time to deal with the consequences." Rick took a small step back. "Let's not blow this out of proportion." Malcolm's laugh was short and humorless. "Blow this out of proportion," he echoed. "That's funny." His expression darkened. "Tell me something, Officer Dunham," Malcolm said. What would you have done if my mother didn't stand her ground? If she got scared and just left? Would you have laughed about it? Would you have felt good about making a black woman feel like she didn't belong here? Rick's jaw tightened. You think this is the first time you've pulled this stunt? Malcolm's tone hardened. You think I don't know who you are? You have a record, Officer Dunham. A long one. Rick's breathing hitched. That's when Malcolm pulled out his phone. A few taps on the screen. Then he turned it around. And there it was. Officer Richard Dunham. Multiple complaints filed. Angela inhaled sharply. Sandy, the waitress, covered her mouth. Eddie took a step forward, because right there on the screen for everyone to see were the complaints. Excessive force, unwarranted stops, harassment, multiple cases dismissed due to lack of evidence. Rick's entire body locked up. You're a disgrace to this badge, Malcolm said, his voice laced with pure disgust. And it's time somebody did something about it. Rick's hands started shaking. Malcolm, listen. Malcolm raised a hand, silencing him. You don't get to say my name. The words hit like a slap. Rick's face burned with shame. Malcolm tucked his phone back into his pocket, his eyes never leaving Rick's. I've already sent in the report, he said casually. I'm sure your superiors will want to have a little chat. Rick's heart dropped. His superiors. That meant his job was on the line. You can't just... Rick stammered, but the words died in his throat. Because yes, Malcolm could, and he did. Angela, who had been quiet this whole time, finally spoke up. You always saw yourself as the one in charge, she said softly. The man who could push people around, make them feel small. Well, how does it feel now? Rick couldn't answer, because for the first time in his life, he was the one feeling powerless, and he hated it. Malcolm let out a slow breath. Get out, he ordered. Rick's head snapped up. What? You heard me, Malcolm said. Get out of this diner, and don't ever speak to my mother again. Rick hesitated. His pride screamed at him to fight back, but there was nothing left to fight with. With his face burning and his hands clenched into fists, Rick turned on his heel and stormed out. The diner door slammed shut behind him, and just like that, Rick Dunham was gone. For the first time in years, Angela felt like she could breathe. The diner remained silent. Then, slowly, people started moving again. Angela glanced at Malcolm, who was still watching the door, his jaw tight. He turned to her. Are you okay, Mom? Angela reached over and gently squeezed his hand. Thanks to you, baby, she whispered. Thanks to you. Eddie, the busboy, stepped forward. His hands were shaking, but his voice was strong. Chief Carter, he said. Malcolm turned to him. Yeah? Eddie swallowed. I just wanted to say thank you for standing up to him. Malcolm held his gaze. That's my job, he said simply. And for the first time, Eddie smiled. Sandy let out a deep breath and nodded at Malcolm. Your mother raised one hell of a man, she said. Angela smiled. Oh, trust me, she said softly. I know. Rick Dunham stumbled out of the diner, his face burning with shame. The moment the door slammed shut behind him, the night air felt suffocating. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had always been the one in control, always the one people feared. He had been untouchable, his badge a shield, his uniform a weapon. But now, his entire career was hanging by a thread. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, his mind racing. Internal affairs. Malcolm had sent a report. That meant Rick's superiors would be looking into his record, pulling up every complaint, every misunderstanding he had swept under the rug. If they took this seriously, if Malcolm really followed through, his job, His entire life could be over. His jaw clenched. No, this wasn't over. He turned back toward the diner, rage boiling in his veins. He couldn't just let some arrogant black police chief walk all over him. He had to do something. His fingers hovered over his gun. Too many people inside. Too risky. Instead, he punched in a number on his phone. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. "Yeah?" Rick glanced around, making sure no one was nearby. Then, in a low, venomous whisper, he said, "I need a favor." Angela sighed, finally allowing herself to relax. The past 20 minutes had felt like an eternity. For so long, she had been forced to swallow her pride, to let men like Rick Dunham walk all over her. Not anymore. She looked across the table at Malcolm, her son, her protector. He sat with his arms crossed, his expression still tight, his mind still working. She knew that look. Malcolm wasn't done. "Baby," she said softly. "He's gone. It's over." Malcolm shook his head. "Not yet." Angela frowned. "What do you mean?" Malcolm leaned forward. "Rick's not the type to just walk away. He's going to push back. He's desperate now, and desperate men do stupid things." Angela's stomach twisted. "He wouldn't he?" Malcolm interrupted. "Mom, that man hates that I took his power away. I put a target on his back and he knows it." Angela didn't want to believe it, but deep down, she knew Malcolm was right. Rick wasn't just going to accept defeat, and that meant they weren't safe yet. Rick leaned against his squad car, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. The voice on the other end of the call spoke. "You want me to handle it?" Rick's pulse pounded. His mind was a storm of rage, fear, and desperation. "No," he said after a moment. "Not yet." He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Think, Rick. Think." He needed a way to shut Malcolm down, permanently. And suddenly, he had an idea. A slow, twisted grin crept onto his face. "If Malcolm Carter wants to play games," he muttered, "then I'll make damn sure he loses." He climbed into his cruiser, turned the key, and sped off into the night. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Malcolm's alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., like it did every morning. He rolled over, rubbed his face, and sat up. His body was exhausted, but his mind was sharp. He had spent half the night on the phone with Internal Affairs, making sure Rick's file was being reviewed immediately. If all went well by the end of the week, Rick would be suspended, possibly fired. But Malcolm wasn't naive. Rick wouldn't just accept that. He would fight. He would retaliate. And Malcolm needed to be ready. He showered, dressed, and was out the door by 6:15 a.m., heading straight to the precinct. As soon as he walked in, he felt it. The tension, the whispers, the eyes on him. He made his way to his office, but before he could close the door, his assistant, Detective Lisa Monroe, rushed in. "You need to see this," she said, handing him a folder. Malcolm opened it, and what he saw made his blood run cold. A misconduct complaint. Against him, filed by none other than Rick Dunham. The accusation? Abuse of power. Malcolm's hands tightened into fists. That snake, that coward. Lisa shook her head. "We both know this is garbage, but he got it in fast. If Internal Affairs is already looking at him, he's trying to flip the script." Malcolm let out a slow, controlled breath. "How bad is it?" he asked. Lisa hesitated. "It's enough to stall the investigation against him. Maybe even enough to get the review board looking into you instead." Malcolm gritted his teeth. Rick was trying to turn the tables, make Malcolm look like the bad guy before he could get taken down himself. This was war now. Angela's words from the night before echoed in his head. "He's gone. It's over." But it wasn't. Rick was still playing dirty. and if Malcolm didn't act fast, he might just lose everything. Malcolm stared at the complaint in his hands, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. Rick had played his last card. This wasn't just retaliation. It was a direct attack on Malcolm's integrity, his career, and everything he had worked for. For a moment, just a brief moment, Malcolm felt something deep and bitter stir inside him. Rage. Not just at Rick, but at the system that let men like him pull these kinds of moves and get away with it. But Malcolm had spent his entire life learning how to stay calm under pressure. And he wasn't about to lose now. He took a slow, controlled breath and looked up at Lisa. "Who's handling the complaint?" Lisa hesitated. "Captain Reynolds. And you know how he is. He hates bad press. If this thing gains traction, he might actually—" Malcolm cut her off. "Let him try." Lisa blinked. "Wait, you're not worried?" Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. "Oh, I'm worried. For Rick. Because this time, Malcolm wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going to end Rick Dunham for good." Malcolm walked into the meeting room with his head high, his posture unshaken. He wasn't just a man defending his name. He was a man walking into battle. Seated at the long table were 3 high-ranking officers, including Captain Reynolds. At the far end sat Rick, looking smug, his arms crossed over his chest. Malcolm took his seat without acknowledging him. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Chief Carter, as you know, Officer Dunham has filed a complaint against you for abuse of power, stating that you used your position to intimidate and humiliate him in a public setting." Malcolm didn't react. He let them talk. Rick smirked. "That's right," he said, leaning back in his chair. "It was a personal vendetta. I mean, let's be real. He wouldn't have done this if it weren't for his own mother being involved." Reynolds turned to Malcolm. "Chief, do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Malcolm folded his hands together. "Yes," he said calmly. "I'd like to enter some evidence." Rick's smirk faltered. Reynolds frowned. "What kind of evidence?" Malcolm reached into his bag, pulled out a folder, and slid it across the table. Reynolds flipped it open. Inside were printed copies of every single complaint ever filed against Rick Dunham. Every instance of racial profiling. Every case of unnecessary force. Every internal report that had been conveniently lost over the years. And at the very bottom, a fresh complaint, filed by Malcolm himself. Reynolds' face darkened. "Where did you get this?" Malcolm's eyes didn't waver. "From the people he's hurt," he said. "Because unlike Officer Dunham, I don't just silence complaints, I listen to them." Rick's face drained of color. "This is bull." Malcolm cut him off. "No, Rick. What's bull is you thinking you could turn this around on me and walk away clean." Reynolds leaned forward. "Chief Carter, are you saying you believe Officer Dunham is unfit for duty?" Malcolm met his gaze. "I'm not saying it. I'm proving it." Then, before anyone could respond, Malcolm pulled out one last piece of evidence. His phone. And he pressed play. The room filled with the sound of Rick's own voice, his conversation from the night before, the one he thought had been private, the one where he said, "If Malcolm Carter wants to play games, then I'll make damn sure he loses." The one where he admitted he was trying to set Malcolm up. Rick's mouth fell open. The entire room went silent. Reynolds' face turned stone cold. "Officer Dunham," he said, his voice low, "do you have anything to say for yourself?" Rick's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing. He had nothing, because he was done. Finished. Malcolm leaned forward, his voice quiet but lethal. "You think you're untouchable, Rick," he said. "You never were. And now, everyone knows it." Rick's hands curled into fists. "You set me up." Malcolm's laugh was sharp. "No, Rick," he said. "You set yourself up. I just made sure the right people heard it. Reynolds turned to Rick. Officer Dunham, you are immediately suspended without pay while a full investigation is conducted. And given this evidence? He exhaled sharply. I'd start looking for another career. Rick's face twisted in horror. No, you can't. Reynolds slammed the folder shut. Get out of my sight. Rick stood up so fast his chair tipped over. His face was red, his breath ragged. He turned to Malcolm, eyes burning with hatred. You think you won? He spat. This department's full of guys like me. You think you can change that? Malcolm stood up too. His voice was calm, steady. I don't think I can, he said. I know I will. And with that, Rick stormed out. For the last time later that evening, Malcolm returned to Maggie's diner. Angela was sitting in their usual booth, sipping coffee. When she saw him walk in, her eyes softened. It's done? She asked. Malcolm sat down across from her. It's done. Angela nodded slowly. How do you feel? She asked. Malcolm exhaled, like it wasn't enough. Angela reached across the table and took his hand. Baby, she said, squeezing it gently. It was enough for today. Malcolm met her gaze, and for the first time that day, he smiled. Outside, the neon sign flickered against the night sky, and for the first time in a long time, the world felt just a little bit lighter.